pleasure to welcome you this afternoon on behalf of our Board of Trustees and the Chairman of our Board, Mr. Bolton, who is not able to be with us this afternoon. You can certainly all proceed with your dessert and your coffee. We do want to get started approximately on time because we must end this meeting promptly at 2:05. We will be on time. Our format will be as usual. Question and answers will follow the ambassador's address. We'd like to thank the Knoxell Corporation for sponsoring the reception this afternoon and the World Trade Center Institute for being supportive of this particular program. The Council's next program will be November the 23rd. Wayne S. Smith, who headed the U.S. Interest Section in Havana and was the State Department's top expert on Cuba before he resigned in 1982, will deliver a critique of current American foreign policy in Central America and the Caribbean. That's the 23rd at 6 p.m. Familiar as the topic, prospects for peace, is to all of us. Aspects of it are certainly always new, as Mr. Arafat's predicament suggests, and certainly the topic remains ever important to us. We respect and welcome the views of Israel, an important and great ally of the United States, and an ever-wise observer and counselor on the affairs of the region. It is our privilege to have as our guest today to discuss the topic of prospects for peace in the Middle East, the distinguished representative of Israel in the United States. As many of you know very well, Ambassador Rosenne holds a PhD with honors in international law from the Sorbonne, has been in government service since 1953, was the legal advisor to the Israeli Foreign Ministry from 1971 to 1979, participating in the critical negotiations of that period, including Camp David. He served as Israel's ambassador in France until his nomination as the ambassador of Israel to the United States in May 1983. It's my privilege to introduce you to our guest, who will speak on prospects for peace in the Middle East, the distinguished ambassador of Israel to the United States, Dr. Meir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Before starting, I would like to introduce to you two members of the staff of our embassy, and I speak always in the presence of my lawyer. I have here Consul General Yaakov, who is Consul General for the Washington area, and our Consul for the Press, Victor Harel. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon. Of course, it needs a lot of courage to speak about prospects of peace, since you have all read the newspapers today. The situation in Lebanon, the fighting going on between Syria and the PLO, the war between Iraq and Iran, and so on. And in spite of this, and the title, I didn't change the title of this talk. I will not be very long in order to enable you to ask questions. Yes, I think there are prospects for peace in the Middle East. And the first case in which an Arab country was ready to negotiate peace with Israel, this was Egypt. In 1977, we negotiated peace with Egypt. Israel gave back all of Sinai, the oil wells, the military bases, the naval bases, the Straits of Tiran, the city of Yamit, and of Iraq. You remember how 4 years ago we were accused of being intransigent, impossible. The negotiations took too long. It took exactly 6 months to reach a peace treaty between two countries that have fought at least 4 or 5 wars for 32 years. A lot of bad publicity. We had the opportunity to read it in the press. And this intransigent Israel gave everything back and signed a peace treaty with Egypt. What was the reaction of the world? The UN has adopted since then about 18 resolutions condemning the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. The Human Rights Commission has adopted since 1979 every year at least 2 resolutions condemning the peace treaty. And this is done, of course, with the budget of this organization that had the opportunity to condemn the United States only 24 hours ago. And as you could see, Israel voted with the United States in this matter as a question of principle. We had to fight all these wars not because we want wars. We would like to live in peace with all our neighbors. And we have a lot to do in our country. Why isn't there peace in the area to this very day? Before entering the details of what goes on in Lebanon, the Palestinian question, and so on, I think that the basic problem is not a question of territory. It's not the question of the border, whether it should be 5 square miles more or less. The basic problem is that the Arab states simply refuse to recognize the state of Israel. And in this respect, we don't think that there is any difference between extremists and moderate Arab states. Maybe when it comes to problems between East and West, there are differences between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, between Libya and Jordan. But when it comes to Israel, all these countries refuse to sit down with Israel and negotiate peace. This is why you don't have peace yet in the Middle East. And we had the opportunity to see it concretely 3 years ago. Just to give you as an example, and this is not just a philosophical approach to the matter, it's very concrete. 3 years ago, Israel submitted to the UN a formal proposal to establish in the Middle East a nuclear-free zone under safeguards of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency from Vienna. And something along the lines of the Tlatelolco Treaty that you have for Central America, for Latin American countries, and that was established after a meeting in an international conference. All the Arab states, with the exception of Egypt, voted against this proposal because they said that any acceptance of this conference would imply the recognition of the state of Israel. And since Israel has no right to exist, they are not ready to sit down with us at any international conference. And this position was reinforced 18 months ago at an international conference of all Muslim states in Tayyip, Saudi Arabia, which according to the vocabulary used is considered as a moderate state. And at this conference, a resolution was adopted unanimously that the holy war, the jihad against Israel, should go on. Of course, quite often in the history of Israel, whenever we had negotiations, discussions with our best friends, we were told that all these statements, all these resolutions are necessary for internal consumption. I remember when I was the advisor to Golda Meir, it was on the eve of the Yom Kippur War in October '73. We had the visit of a very prominent statesman from Europe who came at that time to Israel after a visit to Syria and to Egypt. And when Golda Meir raised with him the problem of the campaign waged in the press of these two countries against Israel and the military preparations that we saw at that time, he told Golda Meir that she shouldn't pay attention to it because it's done for internal consumption. Unfortunately, our intelligence evaluation was not based exclusively on the talk with this statesman, but we saw what happened in the Yom Kippur War. On the holiest day of our religion, we were attacked both by Egypt and by Syria in spite of the ceasefire provisions that were accepted by both countries in '67. Since that day, Israel pays a lot of attention to threats. Israel pays less attention to any promises. And this could explain to you why And I really don't speak, sometimes I have the impression that whenever we bring up our arguments and we try to explain our case, this is sometimes considered as being as arrogant. I don't think that this is the case. We come up with proposals to sit down and negotiate peace. It has been rejected for the last 35 years. Instead of having a negotiation between Israel and the Arab countries, we have quite often, from time to time, proposals coming from third parties that try to decide how the problems of the Middle East should be solved. And we systematically and independently of the Israeli government and power, these proposals are being rejected. And we are told, after all, why did you reject it out of hand in a matter of 24 hours? Why didn't you say there are some positive points and some negative points in these proposals? There are some that are acceptable, some that are unacceptable to you. But rejecting it immediately, this creates a bad image of Israel. It's true, we would like very much to have a good image. Everybody would like to have a good image. But when it comes to questions that are of vital importance to Israel, you sometimes might get a bad image in the press, but you survive. I remember how on the eve of the 6 Days War, everybody went down on the street, and I was at that time stationed in New York. There was a march for Israel on Riverside Drive. About 300,000 people went down on the streets. It was the same thing in Paris, London, everywhere, to protest against the threats coming from Egypt that we were going to be all thrown into the sea. And we had the 6 Days War, and Israel won that war. And one of our journalists published a very nice article, How Israel Lost the Sympathy of the World. Had Israel disappeared in '67, imagine the number of monuments you would have had all over the world commemorating the courage of these people that were thrown into the sea and died. And then he went on to say that every country decided at the UN to have one day that would be devoted to the study of the history of this valiant people of Israel and so on. But Israel lost the sympathy of the world because it decided that if it had to choose between monuments and existence, we still prefer the existence. And it's really, I don't say it out of any intention, we don't intend to dominate anybody. We cannot accept the different plans that come up from time to time, whether they are called the FAD plan, the FAS plan, the Rogers plan, or other plans, simply because when such a plan is being presented, it gives the impression to the Arabs, to the rejectionist front, that by refusing the direct negotiation with Israel, they win. They just have to sit down and wait for the day when a plan would be presented and enough pressure would be applied on Israel to impose this plan on Israel, and this would be the beginning of the end of the state of Israel. So if there is to be peace in the Middle East, there can be peace only through direct negotiations between the parties directly concerned. After all, we were not in a state of war with Britain, France, and so on. The state of war exists between Israel and the Arab countries. And if before any negotiation starts, you submit a plan telling the parties how the problem is to be solved, one may ask, if I would use the language of the fiddler on the roof, who needs a negotiation? If before the negotiation starts, you already established the end result of this negotiation. It makes sense, it's true. Logic and the Middle East, this doesn't go always together. But it's simple logic, and therefore we think that any such plan that is submitted certainly out of the best intentions has negative results. And we have shown how during the negotiations in the Camp David, during these negotiations in Camp David, in 78, 5 years ago, concerning the Palestinian, let's take the Palestinian problem. Israel agreed in the Camp David Accords to recognize the legitimate rights of the Palestinians. Israel agreed to withdraw part of its forces. Israel agreed to have an autonomy for a period of 5 years. And 3 years after the entry into force of this autonomy, there will be negotiations to decide on the final status of the territory. This is what's written in the Camp David Accords. Had the Arab states agreed to sit down and negotiate on the basis of the Camp David Accords, we would be now at the end of the transitional period of 5 years, since these agreements were signed in 1978. And as one of the survivors of these agreements, I can tell you that Egypt was signed these agreements, the United States signed it, we signed it, and we expected Jordan to join in the negotiations. They were twice invited, and they didn't come. And so we started negotiations with Egypt. We thought that Jordan was going to join in these negotiations, and we negotiated in good faith. We wanted the Palestinian Arabs to elect their representatives and to come down and sit with us at the negotiating table, and they didn't show up. Who is accused of sabotaging the negotiation? Israel. Why isn't there any peace? Why isn't there any solution to the Palestinian problem? Because of the settlements. This is what you are told. There was a period when these settlements were considered illegal, then they were not considered anymore illegal, but they are considered as an obstacle to peace. Now you look back at facts. It's true that in a diplomatic life, and having spent 30 years of my life in this profession, sometimes you, sitting at a negotiating table with somebody, you get the impression that he tells you more or less, don't confuse me with facts, my mind is made up. But we have to come back to facts. We have to come back to facts concerning this problem of settlements, since these are certainly the most publicized settlements in the world, although they concern exactly 30,000 human beings. You have there in an area populated by 1,200,000 Arabs, you have 30,000 Jews that live there. Between 1948 and 1967, for 19 years, this area was under Jordanian domination, because in violation of all the resolutions of the UN, Jordan occupied this territory. And for 19 years, there were no Jewish settlements there. There was a total freeze on Jewish settlements. As a matter of fact, the Jordanian army killed all the Jews that were living there. Because in 1948, in Gush Etzion, and in the neighborhood of Jerusalem, there were Jewish settlements. But all the inhabitants were killed. So for 19 years, there were no settlements. This didn't bring peace closer. Then the impression was created that these settlements were established now by the Israeli government, since with all the campaign that went on in different countries of the world, the impression was created that this is a personal policy of Mr. Begin or of Minister Sharon, while these settlements were re-established starting in 1967 already, immediately after the 6 Days War. And if we speak about coexistence between Jews and Arabs, there is no reason why, in the same way as Arabs live in Israel as a minority and a majority of Jews, that Jews should live among a majority of Arabs. Everything can be solved, and this is not because there are settlements that the Arabs have refused for 35 years to sit down with us and negotiate. And when Egypt decided to negotiate with Israel, they did it in spite of the settlements in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. So this is being used simply as a pretext not to come to the negotiating table. So they tell you, yes, but if this goes on like that, there will be nothing to negotiate. There are a lot of things to negotiate, and by refusing the negotiation, they certainly don't enhance peace. But the truth of the matter is that this Palestinian problem is being used by the Arab state in what goes on this morning in Lebanon and the northern part of Lebanon, in Tripoli, where the Syrian army is massacring now the terrorists, the Palestinian terrorists, shows to you to what extent the Arab countries were really interested to solve this problem. They could have solved it already in 1948. Because how was this problem created? And one shouldn't forget the basic facts. 800,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries, leaving behind all their problems. From Iraq and from Egypt and from Syria and from everywhere. And from Yemen. And there were 650,000 Arabs living in Israeli-controlled territory that were incited by the Arabs, by the Arab countries. I heard these broadcasts where they were told, leave this area, we are going to invade Israel, and invaded they did. 5 Arab countries invaded Israel in 48. You shouldn't be victims of our invasion, so you Arabs leave the area. In 2 weeks you'll be back, and you'll be able to possess everything that belonged to the Jews before. It turned differently. There were 60 million refugees at the end of the Second World War. And since the end of the Second World War, all the problems were solved. These Arabs, while the Jews, the 600,000 Jews living in Israel, with the help of the Jewish people, absorbed the 800,000 Jews and shared with them their last piece of bread. The Arab countries, the oil-producing countries, Saudi Arabia, instead of investing $1 for the solution of the refugees from what's called the Palestinian refugees, they invested this money in order to provide funds to the PLO to organize terrorist attacks around the world. This is what happened. So this problem was used by the Arabs as a weapon against Israel, and they were not at all, and they are not interested in solving this problem. The only country for which this issue is not a question of foreign policy is the State of Israel. And when in 1967 we started the administration of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, we started building houses for these that lived in the camps. We were condemned by the UN because we changed, according to the UN resolution, we changed the structure, the demographic constitution of that area. To come to a second, I don't want to monopolize the floor. I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. On the Lebanese problem, Israel didn't start this war against Lebanon because we intended to proceed to the annexation of any territory. We had to do it in the same way that France would have done it had the Red Brigades started shelling the southern part of France, Cannes, Nice, without the Italian government intervening. France would have done exactly what we did. So we had to go into Lebanon to put an end to the infrastructure of this terrorist organization called the PLO. And we found in the camps of the PLO the lists of the terrorists that came from all over the world, from Latin America, from Europe, from everywhere, and they received their training as certified terrorists in the camps of the PLO near Beirut. Lebanon, for 8 years, was victim of a civil war, where you had 100,000 civilians killed. And if there is still a Christian community in Lebanon, in the southern part of Lebanon, it's only due to the Israeli intervention and the Israeli presence there. Now, these talks that go on, we hope that the talks that are going on now in Geneva will succeed. We signed with the Lebanese legitimate government an agreement on May 17th. This agreement was ratified by 65 members of the Lebanese parliament. There were only 2 votes against and 4 abstentions. But Syria put pressure on the Lebanese government to delay the implementation of this agreement. Syria, as I said, occupies today 60% of Lebanon. They organized the terrorist attacks, killing, and on September 4th, 1981, the French ambassador. They bombed the French embassy, the American embassy. They planted a car bomb in the center of Paris a year ago. Unfortunately, we tend to forget, but it's along the same pattern. When a car bomb exploded in the center of Paris last year, France expelled 2 Syrian diplomats, and the French ambassador was called back because there was evidence that it was organized by Syria. This is a regime that doesn't hesitate to kill 30,000 Syrians in Hama when he considers them as being against the government. And when the Israeli delegation and the UN raised this problem of the massacre in Hama, 30,000 people, we were told by the UN that this is considered as a family affair and Israel had no right to raise it. I think that what Syria tries to do now in Lebanon is, of course, to dominate all of Lebanon. They don't hide it. They say it in their broadcasts from Damascus. They have never agreed to see an independent Lebanon. Therefore, you have never had a Syrian ambassador in Beirut. As a matter of fact, 13 years ago, Assad wanted to put an end to the independence of Jordan when he mobilized his troops at the Jordanian border in order to re-establish Greater Syria. And you have it in the Kissinger's memoirs, the details about the Israeli presence there with our tanks. We mobilized them, and this prevented the end of Jordan as an independent state. So what Syria tries now is to put enough pressure on Lebanon to cancel this agreement. The only basis for the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon is the agreement that was signed by these two countries. And as I said before, we have absolutely no intention to stay there one day more than it's strictly necessary. We are committed to withdraw from Lebanon, and we will withdraw as soon as this agreement enters into force and the security of Israel is ensured. The last point, and you should hear my different items in the Hebrew word that starting with the last, we read from right to left. The last point is the relations between Israel and the United States. I think that due to the campaign waged by our enemies, the impression was sometimes created that Israel and the United States were nearly in a state of war. There were differences of opinion in the past, that's true, but I think that this was more a discussion inside the family than anything else. And we fight for the same principles, for the same ideals. Israel is extremely grateful for the assistance given by the United States to Israel. On the other hand, and this now is no secret anymore, if the secrets, the technological data concerning the MiG-19, 21, 23, 25, the tanks, T-54, 55, 62, 72, the missiles, SAM-6, 7, 8, 9, and all these technological data reached the West. It was due to Israel that they had a very close cooperation with the United States in this respect. I am convinced that in spite of this grim situation that you see today in the Middle East, with this war going on between Iraq and Iran for 3 years, where you have already 100,000 prisoners and close to 300,000 casualties, although you don't read very much about it, it's still going on. With the instability that you have in the area, there is one area where there is stability. This is the border between Israel and Egypt, although we have problems with the implementation of this treaty, since Egypt has withdrawn its ambassador a year ago, and Egypt is in fact violating the peace treaty. We hope that they will send back the ambassador and they will resume negotiations concerning the normalization of relations. In spite of all this, I am convinced that we will have peace in the Middle East, and if enough pressure is being put on Syria now, we will be able to implement the second agreement between Israel and an Arab country, meaning the agreement between Israel and Lebanon. Thank you very much for your attention. If there are any questions, I'll try to answer.
Mr. Ambassador, I understand that the Egyptian ambassador to Israel is being withheld because of a problem called the Canadian camp. And that's something that I'm not very familiar with. I wonder if you were in a position to tell us what the Canadian camp is.
Well, the problem of what's called the Canadian camp, this is the name of the camp of refugees, which is the border between Israel and Egypt. It's not a major problem. Egypt withdrew its ambassador last year. I remember when we met first time after the signing of the peace treaty with the Egyptians in Cairo. Of course, this was an event for everybody after 2,000 years. They told me that they had a joke about about then Prime Minister, and if I promised not to be offended, they were going to tell me that joke. And here's what they told me. He says, you know, the story goes in Cairo that when President Sadat came to Israel, Jerusalem, the first time, Prime Minister Begin offered him a tie as a gift. And when they met the second time in Ismailia, Prime Minister Begin offered him, President Sadat, a second tie as a gift. And when they met in Washington in March 79 to sign the peace treaty, President Sadat put on one of the ties he received from Prime Minister Begin. Prime Minister Begin looks at President Sadat and tells him, aha, President, you don't like the second tie I gave you. Just to give us the, I mean, this, by saying that we are not the easiest one during a negotiation, which is not true. We are very conciliatory, as you all know. The fact is that they withdrew their ambassador last year in spite of a specific provision that we had in the agreement, and I remember we insisted at that time, the lawyers insisted to have a reference to the presence of a resident ambassador, not an ambassador. So then the Egyptian delegation was not very keen in accepting it, but they accepted it. It was signed by both countries. They withdrew him last year because of the war in Lebanon. And they told us that as soon as there is an agreement signed between Israel and Lebanon, they will send back the ambassador. In spite of the agreement that was signed and ratified, they didn't send back the ambassador. And the last we heard is that they are going to send back the ambassador as soon as we will put a freeze on the settlements, which is of course not going to happen. And there is absolutely no linkage between the situation in the Judea-Samaria and the treaty between Israel and Egypt. So of course the violation of the treaty by Egypt has a very bad impact on our public opinion, and rightly so, because if you reach the conclusion that if you sign an agreement with an Arab state, you do your share, you fulfill your obligations, and the other side doesn't, it's not very encouraging for the peace peace process. But let's hope that they will send them back. Yes, please.
Two matters concerning the relationship of the United States and Israel. The first is, is it true that Israel offered the use of medical facilities to the U.S. troops that were injured in Lebanon, and the U.S. refused? Secondly, how will Israel look upon the U.S. advancement of using a strike force in Jordan to be ready to go throughout the Middle East should there be problems? My understanding was this idea was fostered or is still in the process of being worked on.
I'll start with the second question. Maybe you'll forget the first one in the meantime. As far as transfer of any weapons to any Arab country that is in a state of war with Israel, we are against it. We don't want to see the armies of any of the Arab countries that are in a state of war with us, that refuse the peace negotiations, to get strengthened by any weapons, and we have expressed our opposition to this. As to the medical facilities offered by Israel, the only thing I can tell you is that that's correct. We offered equipment and medical facilities when this terrible tragedy occurred. This is the only thing I can tell you. Yes, please. Yes, please.
There's been some discussion about whether or not the UN can ever play an effective role in solving any problem. It's condemned the United States yesterday, and has condemned Israel many times. How do you view the future of the United Nations problems?
We have a debate in Israel. What is the lowest point on earth? Is it the Dead Sea or the UN? We think that what happens at the UN is in fact the violation of the Charter. Those that has created the UN, as you know, inherited the previous international organization, the League of Nations, and there was the headquarters were in Geneva. We think that what happened in these last years since the creation of the UN, in fact since '45, you had the double standard at the UN, systematic violation of the Charter, and the use of the UN by those that are against democracy and against freedoms. What should be done is to make sure that the UN acts in accordance with the Charter. A study was made, and apparently out of the 158 members of the UN, you have only about 35 or 36 democratic states. So the way you see that the UN is being used, to give you just one example, of course we provide about 40% of the debates of the UN since the creation of this organization. And this is being published and translated in the 5 working languages, including and it's in Russian and English and Chinese and Spanish and so on. Since the creation of the UN to this very day, in spite of our appeals to the UN, and the first years I remember when we had terrorist attacks inside Israel in 1955, I recall we had 8 children killed in a yeshiva in Ramleh. We went to the Security Council, and the Security Council refused to condemn these assassinations. As a matter of fact, since 1948 to this very day, the UN never condemned any terrorist attack. On the contrary, when we went to Entebbe, the UN discussed a resolution to condemn Israel for what we did. When the Jewish athletes were killed in Munich in '72, there was no condemnation by the UN. And when you had the anti-Semitic attacks in Europe, there was absolutely no condemnation by the UN. The violation of the rights of the Jews in the Soviet Union, no reference in the UN documents. So this double standard is still there, and I think that the organization as such should exist, but it should go back to the original terms, the spirit of those that established the UN in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. And if you read the Charter, the aim of this organization is to solve all problems by peaceful means, to ensure security and so on. So to sum it up, I would say it should exist, but in the spirit and according to the letter of the Charter, and not according to what we see now, where it has lost absolutely all moral impact on anyone. Yes.
How do you see Israel, should the peace process include the West Bank as part of it? How do you see Israel surviving the Jewish state?
As I've heard lately a reference said, tell me, isn't it all this problem, isn't it an economic problem? And what do you see the economy? Says, you are speaking all the time of a West Bank, a bank. I said, it has nothing to do with economics. The problem is a problem of coexistence. And we have absolutely no intention to dominate anybody. And therefore Israel and the Camp David Accord agreed to leave the question of sovereignty and abeyance for the period of the 5 years of the autonomy. So we must see how it is going to work. There was no annexation of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, and the law that applies there is the Jordanian law to this very day. And in fact, the rights of the inhabitants there are larger, much larger than the rights that you have in a situation of military occupation. We claim that we are more than military occupants there, but everybody considers, every state in the world in fact, they consider this as a military occupation, and since there is a war between Israel and Jordan, as long as this state of war goes on, Israel not only has the right, but has the duty to stay there and ensure the security of the population and the security of our forces. But this situation is not a normal one. We would like to normalize the situation, not by imposing our wish or our will or our law, but by sitting down with the inhabitants and negotiate this coexistence. I think that now that the PLO and people finally find out that the PLO doesn't even represent all the terrorists that they claim to represent, not to speak about the Palestinians that live in Judea and Samaria. These Palestinians do not want to destroy the state of Israel. They would like to coexist with us, while the charter of the PLO states very clearly that the aim of this organization is to destroy the state of Israel. This is written in every chapter of the PLO charter. And, sometimes comparisons are made. We are told, after all, the French negotiated with the FLN in Algeria. Why don't you negotiate with the PLO? There is small difference. The Algerian National Movement of Liberation never claimed that France had no right to exist, and they never wanted to establish their capital in Paris. This is not the case with the PLO. So today, I think there is much more hope to see a negotiation going on between Israel, Egypt, the representatives of the Palestinians. They have to elect their own representatives. And as a matter of fact, the only democratic elections that you had in that area were the elections held under Israeli control in 72 and in 76. So they should elect their representatives. We are not going to decide who should represent them. And find the way to coexist. But as I said, there was no annexation, and they are not Israeli citizens. This doesn't change the character of the country.
Suppose they became a part of a greater Israel, then you would have a Jewish minority again in a non-Jewish state.
As I said, there has been no annexation of this territory. These are not Israeli citizens, and you will never have in Israel a situation of second-class citizens. I mean, they cannot be Israeli citizens without having the right to vote and so on. We want to reach an agreement with them as to their coexistence with them, as to the political rights to be exercised by them. Everything can be solved in a discussion, in a pre-negotiation. And we hope that now that the PLO doesn't threaten them the way they did in the past. 17 Arabs that negotiated with us were killed by the PLO. We hope that now there is much more hope to see a solution to this problem through direct negotiations with us. Yes, please.
Looking at kind of a crystal ball from your experience there, do you think that there'll ever be a Palestine nation, or do you think it'll kind of disappear like Armenia, where it eventually blends into the...
Speaking about crystal ball, coming from a country that had prophets and knowing what happened to the last one, they weren't there prophetizing anything. But you know that Jordan has a population that is up to 70% Palestinian. So there is a Palestinian state. In fact, you have today two Palestinian states. You have one Palestinian Arab state, which is Jordan. A second one, a Palestinian Jewish state, which is the state of Israel. And we don't think that there is room for a third Palestinian state, which in fact will threaten both of the other Palestinian states. So what should be achieved is an agreement with those that live in this area, an agreement together with all the parties directly concerned. They are Jordanian citizens today. We should sit down and negotiate, and I'm sure that we will reach a solution. I remember, when the negotiation between Egypt and Israel started, nobody believed that it was going to succeed. And with all due respect to all the experts on Middle Eastern affairs, and there are thousands of them, nobody predicted there was going to be peace between the two countries. So Ben Gurion said once that if you don't believe in miracles in the Middle East, you're not realistic. So I don't think that we need such a big miracle in order to achieve peace. I think that it is achievable.
Well, the king in Jordan represents, I guess he has control, but now represents, what, 20 or 30% of the population?
He represents all of Jordan. I mean, he has been there for more than 20 years, and he's in control of the country, and we hope that one day he will decide to sit down and negotiate with us.
Are these Palestinians in camps, or are they?
No, those that are in
Jordan.
In Jordan, no. They are members of parliament. They are members of government. They are everywhere. No, there are refugee camps too, but the majority doesn't live in camps. Of course not. Yes, please.
Mr. Ambassador, since Israel devaluated its shekel by 23%, I wondered if you would tell us why this was necessary and what effect it's going to have upon the Israeli people.
Yes, speaking about the economy of Israel, there's a lot of talk in the papers. Had we received royalties for the Bible, we wouldn't have any economic problems. But unfortunately, I haven't yet found the right lawyer that could defend our case. You know, our economic system was such that the individual didn't suffer at all because we had a system of total indexation of the wages to the cost of living, which established a situation in which the country became poorer while the individual had a standard of living became higher and so on. Now, the government has decided to cut government spending by about $2 billion a year, which is a lot. Of course, speaking as a civil servant, it will be regrettable to see suddenly that the country is well administered, or even better, with about 10,000 employees less. But this is what's going to happen. We will lower our standard of living, and we will put limitations to our imports, trying to encourage the exports of the country. And there are already measures preventing the accumulation of dollars in the private sector, because up to now it was free. When you look back at the history of Israel, you will find that in 1948, 49, we didn't have enough money to buy food abroad. There was a story that when Prime Minister Ben Gurion came for the first time to this country and met with President Truman, he asked President Truman how much did the average skilled worker in the United States make a month. At that time, President Truman told him about $400 a month. So Ben Gurion asked him how much does he spend. President Truman said about $200 a month. Ben Gurion asked him what happens with the 200 remaining dollars. President Truman said, we are a democratic country, we don't ask questions. How is it in Israel? Ben Gurion said the average skilled worker in Israel makes about 400 pounds a month. How much does he spend? So Ben Gurion said about 800 pounds. So President Truman asked him, where does he get the extra 400? So Ben Gurion said, we are a democratic country, we don't ask. But, you know, the income tax in Israel is up to 70% of the income. Somebody at the Internal Revenue Service in Israel said, look, I lose in this business about 100,000 shekel a month. So they told him, that then close your shop. He says, if I close it, what am I going to have to make a living? So, but it's the highest rate of income tax paid anywhere in the world. And now we are coming out, we put an end to all subsidies to food and the rest. You know, a country that has a budget, we spend 1/3 of our budget for defense, and 1/3 of our budget for the repayment of loans abroad, and only 1/3 remains for schools, hospitals, and so on. We are about 4 million, and we have 1,200,000 pupils in schools and free education. So the burden is very heavy. We spend 25% of our gross national product for defense, while in other countries, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 4.5%, 5%. But as you say, in this country, we shall certainly overcome. And if we could have only peace to spend all this money that goes to defense for the education, social needs, and so on, it would be an excellent thing. Unfortunately, it's not yet there. Yes, please.
Do you feel the multinational peacekeeping force has actually helped increase chances of peace in Lebanon?
It's a very good question. You know how this multinational force came about to be there. It was the beginning in order to protect the 13,000 terrorists that left Beirut. And then they came there at the request of the Lebanese government. We were not involved in this at all. So there are two aspects to the Lebanese problem. You have the questions concerning the security of Israel. And as I said, we ensure the security ourselves. As to the independence of Lebanon and seeing the Lebanese government regaining control over the entire territory, this problem doesn't concern only Israel, it concerns the world at large, and it's up to the different countries to decide what is in their best interest, and I have nothing to add to that. Yes, please.
Would you say that at the present time, Syria and Russia hold the upper hand?
I wouldn't say that they hold the upper hand. You know, for Syria to have the Israeli army at a distance of 17 miles from Damascus, to be protected by, so-called protected by the presence of 7,000 Russians there. Russia has played a major role in trying to prevent peace in the area. One should forget that the Soviet Union vetoed the Camp David Accords and the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And now the Soviet Union is supporting, in fact, the occupation of an independent country. They are supporting the Syrian occupation of Lebanon. So I don't think that they have the upper hand with what goes on now inside Syria itself. The means used by Assad in order to ensure his continuous domination of this country, or that country, the fights going on between Syrians and the terrorists of Arafat, I don't think that this enhances its position in the Arab world by having as protectors the Soviet Union, and by dominating this country with the most cruel and using the most terrible means to do it, by killing people and so on, having these killings once in a while. Yes, please.
How would you, if you had your brothers, recommend that Lebanon should be reorganized? A federalization of the factions, or what? I mean, just if you would tell us what you feel could be done to stabilize the country.
I think that we should leave it to the Lebanese to decide for themselves. And maybe these negotiations will succeed. They have to reach agreement. They live together. And this country, we didn't have with this country any problem. There is no territorial dispute between Lebanon and Israel. They just want to live in peace. This could be, as it was known at the time, as the Switzerland of the Middle East. So now these discussions that go on in Geneva, let's hope that they succeed and they get rid of the Syrian presence there, and they would be able to implement the agreement that they've signed with us. We will withdraw, certainly. We have no intention to stay there. But when it comes to their internal problems, they should decide for themselves, and I don't think that any external intervention would be helpful in this respect. Yes, please. Yes, sir.
Mr. Nostro, would you care to comment on Israel's relationship with third world countries, especially also Black Africa, and is there a dichotomy between the relationship with countries in the United Nations and individual countries' negotiations?
I was very moved. 3 years ago, I attended a World Health Organization meeting in Geneva. And there was, of course, as you know, in all these specialized agencies, even if when you have a conference on the rights of women in Mexico, there is a resolution against the state of Israel. I don't know how it came about, but it was there. So there was a resolution against Israel in the World Health Organization, and one of the African delegates resigned because he refused to vote against Israel. He got his medical training in Jerusalem. And in spite of the fact that many of these African states severed the relations with Israel as a result of Arab pressure after the Yom Kippur War in '73, we are in close touch with many of them. We started providing technical assistance to all these countries already in '49 and then '50, when we ourselves, we needed a lot of assistance. We had our engineers, our doctors go to all these countries, and we have been in touch with them even, and we had our people there even when there were no diplomatic relations. Now, some of them have resumed diplomatic relations with Israel, as you know, Zaire, Liberia, and we hope that more countries from the African continent will resume relations with Israel Our assistance has absolutely no strings attached. We don't try to dominate anybody. We try just, in the right spirit of our history and our religion, to extend a helpful hand to anybody who wants it. And we hope that more countries will reestablish normal relations with us. And the votes at the UN this last year, there has been a change in some of the votes of some of the African countries when they realize that in fact that they are being used by the enemies of Israel, not in order to protect African interests, but in order to fight Israel, and so therefore the Arab states have they had a lot of difficulties to get support from the African countries.